Well, let's unpack part of what has come out of that conference. We're joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, good evening to you. Thanks for your time. The ANC, of course, acknowledging what really is not rocket science, that the party is at its weakest levels ever. And the big question is, what role has this weekend's policy conference played in helping them turn that around?
Good day to you, Kathy, and to the viewers. I think you raise a very, very important question. I mean, listening to the opening address by the president, the 2.5 days of report back from the commission deliberations and some of the recommendations that the president made in his closing address to the conference and bringing the conference to an end. I think the big question for me is, are they listening to themselves? I think they're trying to hit all the right tones in terms of saying there's a weakness. We acknowledge that there's a serious set of crises and capacity issues around what we need to do to turn it around in terms of the theme of organizational renewal, bringing back the kind of ethical, moral and cultural regeneration of the party, the question around the step-aside rule and how that needs to be implemented, and just hitting those tones in terms of what needs to be done in terms of creating what the president called an ethical, capable and developmental state. But are they listening to themselves, and are they willing to then do that in the way that actually creates a pragmatic implementation of policy, but also what they take to the national conference in December as the concrete recommendations and resolutions that they want to pursue in the next 5 years as the government in power.
What's also interesting is the fact that there haven't been any significant moves in as far as a change of policy is concerned. But one would argue that South Africa is in one of its most difficult eras economically. What does that tell us about the kind of solutions that the party has in responding to the very present challenges that South Africa is facing right now?
It says to me that it's an intractable position South Africa finds itself. And hence, the kind of vagueness that you also picked up at this conference in terms of language, in terms of what was emphasized and prioritized in the feedback press briefings from the various commissions, is that they have very little room for maneuver and flexibility, partly because they've kind of snookered themselves, because of not just about COVID-19 or not just where the global geostrategic and economic situation finds itself, the fact that we are vulnerable to external shocks in the context of uncertainty, ambiguity with regard to our dependency on external resources like oil. But it's also the fact that a lot of what they're talking about is critical issues, critical stock that hasn't been done in terms of implementation. Take, for example, on sanitation, water, infrastructure. Take, for example, the rehabilitation of your railway systems, your road, your transport, your infrastructure there. For example, the Peace and Stability Commission around how to deal with crime, security, and so forth. They haven't been present in those kinds of implementation. Yes, the president says we've moved on certain of the resolutions from the previous policy conference, but I think they're also coming back to some of the questions that they haven't been able to move. For example, we look at land reform through the expropriation bill and how we go about that in any way and any form possible. So I think there's a lot here that's left hanging for us to interpret in terms of what's going to be achievable. And then remember, we've got this really, really important dynamic that moves towards December, and that is what kind of top six we're going to have and who's going to come in.
Sanusha, when we look at the state of the economy, and this is something that the conference and those discussion documents have reflected on, you talk about all of these external factors and where they leave South Africa. Economically, it's in a very dire state. There's an acknowledgement of the fact that inequality is at its worst levels ever. But interestingly enough, no clear picture of what then is going to be done to address that. I would have thought that something like the basic income grant would have featured quite prominently in this conference. Also interesting that unemployment, although it's been acknowledged as a big problem, not enough to be declared a crisis.
You know, Kathy, what it says to me, when you can't find that mix. They called it a mixed economy. I listened to the Minister of Public Enterprise. I listened to the other ministers, and of course, some of them are saying we're not ministers. We are comrades at this policy conference. But I listened to the kinds of issues they were talking about. And as much as you see the acknowledgement of the relationship between public and private sector, they were very frightened of the P word to mention privatization. But where does the money come from? Yes, we understand that there's going to be a key driver for this kind of economic model that you have. It has to have investment, both domestic resource mobilization as well as investment that creates policy certainty. We've been saying this, I think, since we've been blue in the face about what the confidence levels are. But I think what's really critical here is that do they have a roadmap on how to deal with this unemployment crisis that was ventilated and discussed in so many ways at this policy conference over the weekend? The second issue, I think, is really the challenge around the model of economic development, the model of an inclusive growth approach. We see that a world over, inflation is actually running away. Food prices are running away. Consumer price index is not being contained. So the model of inflation targeting on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have this external shocks and vulnerability actually doesn't gel. And so the challenge then now is the model of what you are looking at in terms of the mixed economy, or what are you talking about? Is it actually going to find that kind of consensus in terms of where do you find the ways in which to stimulate growth, which is going to create employment? And I think we are suffering from the fact that the world over as well is that this economic growth-led approach to the export growth-led model, etc., is actually not working out. And I think that's, again, kind of deviates and sidesteps the whole question of where is this growth going to come from, in particularly with regard to stimulating the kind of economic opportunities, but also the economic growth in terms of job creation, poverty alleviation, and inequality, addressing the inequality and the intergenerational inequality gaps that are now becoming much more wider than before. So I think the challenge is that they, as I said earlier, they know what the problem is, but the challenge is now what's the formula and what's the implementation and the how.
Pulemabe, the ANC spokesperson, saying that this weekend was not about winners and losers, but undoubtedly there'll be those who walk away from this conference feeling a sense of victory, especially over the resolution to keep the mandate of the step-aside policy.
Well, I think they had no alternative in terms of the step-aside policy, because the step-aside policy was such a ventilated and a critical kind of resolution that came out of the previous conference. And then you saw how it was actually ventilated within the application of it within the party, the NEC, the controversies, the pivotal kinds of reactions to it, certain of the provincial structures asking for it to be scrapped. But I think if they actually did something where they moderated the step-aside rule, or they basically said, gave it a much more deeper kind of ventilation in terms of of the language, etc. I think they would have had a serious dilemma on their hands as per the dilemma they're having quite right now, in terms of if they actually said, you know what, we're going to moderate this, or we're going to actually try and make it a step-aside rule light. Then, of course, the challenge is, what does this mean for renewal of the ANC? What does this mean for ethical behavior? What does this mean for what the president said about giving it the traction that it needs to have? Because that was what his presidency was also built on, in terms of dealing with the malfeasance and the level of unethical behavior, and of course cronyism and patronage networks that have actually become much more deeper than before in the party. So I think they had no alternative but to keep it there. The challenge is what happens in December, from now to December, in terms of what levels of debate happen and what kind of resolution then goes forward to December. And I think this is where there's no winners or losers. The point is that if they had basically pushed it aside, or if they had moderated it, they would have still come out looking as if they're not committed to their own renewal.
It may be less than 6 months, Sanusha, but it's still far, far away. Anything can happen between now and December. We'll leave it there for tonight. Political analyst Sanusha Naidu.